Welcome to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. I'm Tom Williams. A Utah judge tosses the legislature's gerrymandered congressional maps and orders new ones be redrawn. Governor Cox is expected to call Utah lawmakers into a special session. Here's what they might do. And exploring the nastiest divide of all in Utah, Latter-day Saints versus former members. And later in the program, I'll be joined by Salt Lake Tribune State Watch reporter Emily Anderson-Stern and senior religion reporter Peggy Fletcher Stack. Right now, we bring in political reporter Robert Gehrke. Robert, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Tom. How are you?
Good, good. Well, thanks for telling us about this. This is big news, and it kind of keys into national news, and then this particular news has been getting national attention because of that. I think maybe briefly go back to 2018 and bring us forward. That'll help us understand what everything that's happening.
Yeah, sort of lay the groundwork. So as you may remember, in 2018, there was a ballot initiative put on the ballot to create an independent redistricting commission that would draw boundaries for congressional districts, legislative districts, state school board seats. It passed by a narrow margin, but it created this independent redistricting commission, and it also set some standards for how the legislature how the map should be drawn. They wanted the districts to be compact, contiguous. They wanted to, and one of the key parts is that they wanted to prohibit partisan gerrymandering or drawing the boundaries to benefit one party and disadvantage another. The legislature a couple years later essentially repealed the limitations that the Proposition 4 put on them when it came to drawing these maps, and went ahead and drew maps that created 4 safe Republican seats, splitting Salt Lake County into 4 parts, and sort of dividing the Democratic strongholds in Salt Lake County. The League of Women Voters, Mormon Women for Ethical Government, and several of the people who live in Salt Lake County sued, saying that this was depriving them of representation in Congress. Last year, the Utah Supreme Court issued a ruling that yes, in fact, the legislature had overstepped in repealing provisions of this Prop 4, saying that if the voters have a right to exercise right to make laws through the ballot initiative, the legislature simply repealing those initiatives sort of nullifies that constitutional right. So they said that they need a good, compelling reason if they're going to rescind a voter-approved ballot initiative that changes the way government operates. Which brings us to this week. On Monday, Judge Diana Gibson said, no, there wasn't a compelling reason to repeal Proposition 4, and therefore the maps that the legislature drew don't comply with Prop 4. She said very succinctly, Proposition 4 is the law in Utah. She said the maps they drew didn't comply with that, and so she ordered the legislature to go back and redraw the maps. Gave them 30 days to do it. They've got until September 24th, so they're on the clock to get this done. And then the judge will schedule hearings at that point to decide if they've complied with her order.
No, all these arguments before the court reminds the legislature has been saying that they have I don't know if they use the word sole authority, but they have the authority to redraw maps. Nobody else.
Yeah, they argue that Article 9, Section 1 of the Utah Constitution says that the legislature shall draw the maps for these various seats. The judge acknowledged that yes, they have the authority they have the responsibility to do that, but they have to do it in accordance with the law that's in place. And again, she said Prop 4 is the law, and so they draw the maps, but they have to comply with the statute when it comes to how they exercise that authority, and they didn't in this case, she said, and told them to go back and do it again. She also prohibited the maps that they did draw from being used in the 2026 election, which kind of puts them under the gun a little bit to get something in place. The lieutenant governor's office says that they need the new maps, whatever maps are in place, by November 1st, so they can prepare for candidate filing, which starts in January.
One more thing on the Constitution. I think the judge mentioned this. Constitution mentions that the people have co-equal, responsibility or authority here in that. Yeah. Tell me about that.
Yeah, that kind of goes back to what the Supreme Court ruled last year. There's a provision in the in the Utah Constitution, and I'll probably not get it exactly verbatim, but that all power, all political power is inherent in the people. And another section that says they have the right to alter and reform government. And the mechanism for doing that is the ballot initiative. And that sort of is the crux of what the Supreme Court ruled last year, which is to say, if the legislature can just rescind ballot initiatives, then the public loses that right to alter and reform government, and accordingly loses its co-equal power with the legislature.
Now, your latest story, Robert, the Republicans have weighed in. They say they are going to drop some new maps. Is that
Yeah,
true?
yes. So in court filings, even before the ruling, the attorneys for the legislature had said that if they lose this case, that they would appeal it either to the Utah Supreme Court or potentially the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court's been a little bit apprehensive, loath to wade into these state redistricting battles, but they said they would do that. But the legislature on Thursday afternoon put out a statement that said that they would comply with the judge's order. They didn't like it. They thought it unconstitutionally tied their hands and set standards that they shouldn't have to abide by. But they will follow the judge's order and do that while they're still pursuing, as they put it, every legal option available. So anticipate an appeal is likely to the Utah Supreme Court at least. Um, they're, as I mentioned, on a very tight time frame. They don't really like that time frame because they said, when they went through this redistricting process in 2021, they said they had 20 meetings around the state and took 6 months to do it, and it was they think that this sets too short of a time frame and doesn't give them time to engage the public in the process.
So I think the lieutenant governor's weighed in that this all needs to be resolved by November of this year or something like that, right? So that candidates can know which districts, which maps they can use to file.
Yeah, the filing deadline, they moved it up a few years ago. So the filing deadline for candidates is now in January. And they have to have the maps in place then so candidates know which districts they're going to run in. One key point that I should mention is that the judge's ruling only applies to the congressional boundaries. The legislative, House and Senate and the state school board boundaries that the legislature drew were not covered in this initial lawsuit. Logically, one could argue, I guess, that the same legal rationale applies to those seats, but they were not challenged. So this judge's order only applies to the congressional boundaries, and that's, as you mentioned at the outset. I mean, this is getting national attention now, both the Utah ruling, but because we're in this conflict, this battle between Texas and California, that they're each redrawing their boundaries to gerrymander them even more and create more safe seats for Republicans in Texas, Democrats in California, in a competition to try to get a leg up in the midterm elections next year. So now Utah's been thrown into that mix as well. Slightly different circumstances, obviously, but something that is potentially relevant nonetheless.
President Trump has weighed in. What did he say?
Yeah, Wednesday night, President put on Truth Social that he thought that the judge's order was absolutely unconstitutional. He said that the activist judiciary is trying to erode the Republicans' advantage and eliminate their political, agenda. He thinks that Utahns should hold the line against these activist judges. It is interesting because Utah legislators, including Senator Mike Lee, have also referred to this as judicial activism. Judge Gibson, I don't know what her politics are, but she was appointed by Republican Governor Gary Herbert, won unanimous support from the Republican majority, well, from everybody on the Judicial Confirmation Committee, and then in the state Senate, which obviously is a Republican supermajority, she won unanimous confirmation there as well. So it's not like she's a raging leftist, as some have accused her of being, or else I would imagine that Governor Herbert wouldn't have nominated her. But she has definitely drawn the ire with this ruling of the legislature and other political leaders on the Republican side of things.
At least one legislator talked about trying to remove her.
Yeah, Senator Dan McKay said that she ignored the oath that she to uphold the Constitution, and posed it as a question, could she be the first judge removed for ignoring that oath? When I talked to him later, he kind of said he doesn't think this necessarily rises to that level, but he thinks there's a larger conversation that needs to be had about the role that judges are playing. And this fits into something else we've discussed on the program in the past. And the judiciary has issued a series of rulings that have gone against the legislature's will. I mean, they blocked the near total abortion ban. They blocked a bill that prohibited transgender girls from playing in high school sports. Obviously, the Better Boundaries ruling from the Supreme Court last year. Now this one, and it's that has drawn a backlash from Republican legislators who have tried to kind of exert a little bit more control over the courts. There was talk of expanding the number of adding justices, sorry, to the Utah Supreme Court, potentially having judges elected. Those didn't come to fruition, but I think this latest ruling has sort of brought some of those discussions off of simmer and put it back to a boil.
So, tell me what Better Boundaries is saying. Obviously, they're thrilled, I would imagine, but there are a lot of twists and turns left in this whole thing.
Yeah, they recognize that this is just that it's not over. There's still a process that has to be gone through. They were obviously elated with the decision. Um, they are, I think, fair to say, anticipating an appeal potentially, but they want to move ahead with this remapping process as quickly as they can. And they keep bringing it back to this is what voters said that they wanted, and it gives those voters an opportunity to be represented in Congress that they have missed out on since 2022 when these maps were first put into place. So they're cautiously optimistic and watching and hoping that this leads to an outcome where the districts that are drawn are not drawn to disadvantage, one party over the other, or to split up one community, in this case, Salt Lake County.
We've been talking with Salt Lake Tribune political reporter Robert Gehrke, who's been telling us about this big news this week, and I'm sure he'll be covering all the twists and turns as they happen. Robert, thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Take care.
Take care. And following a break, we'll be talking with State Watch reporter Emily Anderson Stern. Here's the headline. Governor Cox is expected to call Utah lawmakers into a special session. Here's what they might do. I hope you'll stay with us following the break. You're listening to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. I'm Tom Williams. We're going to be talking with Salt Lake Tribune State Watch reporter Emily Anderson Stern in this segment. Emily, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tom.
Thank you. Here's one of the headlines we want to talk about. Governor Cox is expected to call Utah lawmakers into a special session. We're going to look at what they might do in that special session. Before we do that, we talked with Robert just in the previous segment about all the ins and outs of this judge's ruling happening earlier this week, which tossed out the congressional maps the legislature did. I want to look with you just briefly, wrapping this up, what might be happening. Give us a little bit of a timeline. What's going to be happening that the judge has set up here in the next, I guess, this week and then maybe in October?
Right. So when Judge Gibson made her ruling on Monday, she set a deadline for lawmakers to draw new maps and that's September 24th. With the deadline, interested parties, is how she put it, will have an opportunity to object to whatever maps are drawn before the end of the day on October 3rd. And then, sometime about a week later, she will have a hearing to discuss and hear those objections.
So a lot of ins and outs, and I think the legislature said that, we'll go ahead and draw some new maps, but they're going to appeal concurrently, right?
Right, yeah. They'll be appealing to the Utah Supreme Court, and they said they will go ahead and draw maps. this timeline kind of aligns with the expected special session of the legislature. And so, it looks like it's likely that these maps would be approved when they come together then in about the middle of September.
Ah, yeah, interesting. One more thing, you have pictures of those maps drawn up by Utah's Independent Redistricting Commission. Those were overridden, right? And the legislature did something different in 2021. I guess as I'm looking at these maps, the big difference is these proposed maps don't quarter Salt Lake County, right? They don't split that very populous center up into 4 parts.
Right. Like Salt Lake County is, it's pretty well known that it's the most populous part of the state, and it's also the most blue part of the state. So when lawmakers adopted their own map, they split, we've got a supermajority Republican legislature. Obviously, they would prefer that we have 4 Republican members of Congress. And so they ended up splitting the bluest part of the state in 4. And that's what supporters of this lawsuit say was political gerrymandering, which Proposition 4 was supposed to outlaw. If that part of the state is kept together, just at least to some extent, then there's a chance that we could have a Democratic member of Congress.
All right. Well, I'm sure you and Robert and others will be following all the twists and turns as they happen. I want to turn to the special session. This is interesting. I'd forgotten this. You reported Governor Cox had a handful of bills that he kind of held his nose and signed. He didn't like everything in it, and he said, "I'll sign it, but I want you to come back and fix some of this stuff in the special sessions." I guess he'll now be calling a special session.
Yeah, he's expected to. At his monthly news conference earlier this month, he, spoke about some of what's expected to come. And so we'll see what might be in a declaration from him convening the legislature. In those, he usually gives instructions as to what he wants them to address. But when he wrote a letter to legislative leaders at the end of the session last year, he did talk about a couple of bills that he was signing, but he said that he expected that in the next year, lawmakers would come together in a special session and change those. One of those was around election records, and it was meant to make more election records maintained and created by counties available to the public. But county clerks throughout the state who have a pretty busy job when it comes to elections have said that they asked the governor to veto that, saying that the bill was too expensive and it would be burdensome for their offices with their staffs, especially in rural counties where they have pretty small staffs, or maybe it's just the county clerk primarily doing election work. And so they asked for a veto. They didn't get it, but because Governor Cox said he wanted to encourage transparency, but he did ask that lawmakers work with county clerks to make the bill more doable for them.
So what else is likely to come up in a special session?
Yeah, so there's another bill kind of that is somewhat related to elections that Governor Cox asked lawmakers to work on in a special session in that same letter. And, it's one that was, that talked about how county councils are formed. And it had required Wasatch and Summit counties to draw districts for county council members instead of electing them at large, which is what they've done in the past. And the new version of the bill would take Wasatch County out of that mix and make it so only Summit County has to draw districts to elect county council members. There are also a number of other topics that legislators are going to address. I would say the potentially most controversial one is the the bill that banned public employee unions from negotiating with their employers, with the government. Earlier this year, folks who opposed that broke records in gathering signatures to put a referendum on the ballot next year. And there's a possibility that in the special session, lawmakers could act to do a few things to change that, and it would potentially pull the referendum off of the ballot. So they could potentially repeal the law altogether. They could change the law. They could repeal the law and replace it with something else. Lawmakers are also weighing not doing anything in a special session. So that's something that could come up that a lot of people are keeping their eye on. And there's also another bill that state lawmaker Representative Carrie Ann Lisenby is looking at bringing concerning elections. And it's a proposal that she says would stop non-citizens from voting. And I will note that's already illegal, and people are prosecuted if it's shown that they're not a citizen and they've voted in an election here. But she says that there needs to be changes to election administration itself to prevent that from happening. I will say that the governor has said in his news conference he wasn't sure if something like that might be included in the special session. But he did say that if that is happening, that it should be prosecuted. And he was kind of non-committal about where he would stand on such a bill. There are also, you just spoke with Robert Gehrke about some of lawmakers' displeasure with decisions coming out of the courts. In this last session, we saw a number of bills targeting the courts and taking some power away from the judiciary. There's one that the governor vetoed that would have given him the power to choose the Chief Justice of the Utah Supreme Court. And that's being revived, but with a couple tweaks. In the past, it was going to be that the governor would choose the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court every 4 years. And in a new version, it would be every 8 years. And that was a compromise that the governor's office reached with the legislature. Currently, justices pick their own Chief Justice. And so this would take that ability away and put it into the hands of the governor. And then there will also be discussions likely about the Great Salt Lake and giving more direction to state officials in how they manage the Great Salt Lake Causeway berm that separates the northern and southern portions of the lake to help control some salinity levels, especially on the southern side of the lake, where there is more life to protect brine shrimp, flies, migrating birds. And there are a number of other law bills they'll likely look at, but most of those are cleanup bills to kind of clean up mistakes in code.
Oh, the session's likely to happen next month, I guess. The governor still hasn't called it, but he's likely to.
Yeah, it's right now tentatively would likely be around the week of September 15th, but again, we've not seen a declaration from the governor, and we will see when that comes and what's in it.
I think we have time to just very briefly treat this story. Here's the headline: Utah National Guard is asking service members to volunteer for an ICE operation. The governor is willing, I guess, right, with proviso that Utah National Guard not be actually arresting immigrants.
Yeah, the governor said when questions have come up about whether the Utah National Guard will be one of the state guard units to help ICE, he said that he does not see members of the National Guard as he doesn't see their role as being law enforcement per se, not conducting arrests, not putting their hands on detained immigrants. The Utah National Guard has been one of about 20 states to have their guard units authorized by the Department of Defense to help the Department of Homeland Security in enforcing immigration laws. And now we're seeing that under that authorization, the Utah National Guard is being asked to help out starting next month, likely, and going through November or longer. November is when the authorization expires. So the Defense Department would have to authorize the National Guard to help DHS and ICE out again. But as far as what the National Guard is telling troops right now, that their responsibilities would be, it would be, a lot of administrative tasks in like fingerprinting intake of detained immigrants, and then helping with some transportation efforts because there aren't any ICE detention centers in the state. They would be helping drive detained immigrants to immigration detention centers outside of Utah.
All right, we've been talking with Salt Lake Tribune State Watch reporter Emily Anderson-Stern, telling us about several of these stories. Emily, thank you so much.
Thanks, Tom.
And when Behind the Headlines continues, we'll be talking with senior religion reporter Peggy Fletcher Stack. Here's the headline: Exploring the Nastiest Divide of All in Utah, Latter-day Saints versus former members. You're listening to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. I'm Tom Williams. We turn next to Salt Lake Tribune senior religion reporter Peggy Fletcher Stack. Peggy, thanks so much for joining us.
Happy to be here.
Very important story. Here's the headline: Exploring the Nastiest Divide of All, Latter-day Saints versus former members. And so you and your colleague Tamar Kemsley have last year you did dating across religious divides, right?
We did. This is our third in our series about the unspoken divide, religious divide in Utah. The first one was about neighborhoods that included kids and schools and things like that. And then our second one was about dating. This is our third one.
So you start with some metaphors, like the breakup of Lennon McCartney, Democrats versus Republicans. Then you get to, I guess, the most apt metaphor for this kind of a divide. What is that?
We came up with this idea that it's really a lot like a divorce. It's more than a breakup of a band or people on different teams, because a divorce includes people that were once knew each other very intimately. They were married, they shared the same values, they had the same goals. And when one person chooses not to share those values anymore, not to share the goals and the approach, it does feel like a divorce to many people.
You talked to Patrick Mason, who's here at Utah State University, the Arrington Chair of Mormon Studies. I'm just going to quote this from your story.
Yeah.
He says that this divide, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints versus former members of the church, is the defining feature of Utah cultural life. That's quite, and it rings true to me, at least.
It does seem to be true. We interviewed a lot of people, and we put out a query to our readers, and we got nearly 1,400 responses to it, which told me we hit a nerve and that this was something that was on everyone's mind, and it was pretty fascinating. We thought we would get more responses from former members than we did from current active members. But in fact, we got sort of almost equal numbers of both, which I thought was pretty fascinating, that both sides of this divide recognize this is a problem.
So what are some of the factors that make this so loaded? There's another word I think that Patrick Mason uses. I guess maybe let's go where you go next in your story. Talked with Scott Howell, right?
Yeah.
Who is a former member of the legislature, a Democrat, and he talked about this a little bit. What did he say?
Well, I'm trying to remember. He said a lot of things.
Hmm.
He said that no family is immune, really. Almost all families in Utah have Latter-day Saint families have someone who has left, and then, but it also touches the political parties. Sometimes people who have left want to make a statement, a sort of a public statement that they're no longer with the majority faith. And so they change their identities, and some of them join the Democratic Party to do that. Uh, it's painful on both sides for members who are devout members. It isn't just, choosing a different lifestyle. It's they perceive it as really betraying the theological ideas about eternity, that the people who choose who opt out no longer will be in the same place in heaven. And that's a bigger deal than just, deciding to be a Democrat or Republican. And so people who have left feel that pressure. They feel pressure from their families. They feel judged. They feel lost. They feel misunderstood. And so, talking to people on both sides, I really could empathize with both sides of this divide.
Let's talk about a few people that you kind of highlight in the story. Sarah Peterson, who is, I guess, works at Utah Tech University. This illustrates what this how this feels maybe sometimes in families. She says when she told her sister she was leaving the church, they both started crying.
Yeah, again, deeply emotional decision, I think. Also, Sarah talked to us. She she did not tell her family for a long time because she didn't want to hurt them and she didn't want to cause pain. Uh, and so it's kind of, gosh, forcing people to keep secrets and not tell and navigate through that. Uh, and then when it finally came out, there were tears.
So you talked to Matt Evans. He's an active Latter-day Saint in Draper. He organizes outabouts. What are those?
Well, Outabouts, he reached out to us when we did our first Divide series, and it's a kind of a non-threatening party or events where people in the neighborhood just sit out and on their front porch or whatever, and they stroll around and talk to neighbors, or they gather at someone's house, and it's an attempt to really put aside religious differences and relate simply as neighbors and friends. Uh, so he reached out to us on that, but then he had some interesting things to say about the divide, not just in neighborhoods, but this divide between members and former members.
Yeah, he said this is interesting. He says, I guess generally well received, right? These outabouts.
Mhm.
But if a former member, especially, gets what he calls a whiff of church involvement, they're suspicious.
Yeah, I think that several of the people who have left told us this, which is that the people who remain in the faith, who try to have continued relationship with their former Latter-day Saints, they always feel like there's a hidden agenda, like they're trying to bring them back, or, there's this sort of proselytizing undercurrent and a kind of condescension. And former members don't like that.
Hmm.
So, on the other hand, active members just told us that some former members who reject the truth claims of the church and find it to be they use words like toxic or, traumatic, then mem current members sometimes feel former members are trying to proselytize, evangelize the other way, which is, well, I left, all of you should leave. So that just adds this element of mutual distrust. Reading some of our you'll see down below in the story, some of our people feel like they're the people on the other side were reading into every word they said, uh, and it makes for very uncomfortable relationships.
You talked to Utah novelist Meddy Marie Ivy. Interesting experience that she had. Family of 11 children. So she was still in the church. I think a couple of her sisters left.
Right.
And she says relationships there are still not good. They're still severed. And then she finally left, but she said some sisters still in there, brother and sisters still in the faith, she has good relationships with. So that kind of illustrates it's a very complicated thing in families.
Yes, it is. I thought her story was particularly fascinating to me for what you just mentioned, which is that the sisters whom she had alienated when she was still in and they were out, they were never able to really recover that relationship. And yet, when she herself left, a couple of her siblings have really helped her. They don't talk about religion with her, but they've been supportive in every other way, financially, emotionally, practically. And so she feels close to them, despite the fact that they're still in. So it just was to me a good example of how messy this is.
Mm-hmm. And as you said before, this isn't, for believers in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This is not just this life, right? It's the next life.
Yeah.
And the eternal family relationships they believe in. So Alyssa Hughes, I found this very interesting. Alyssa Hughes left the church, but she says she feels like, I guess, family members, people still in the church are just waiting for, the time when she'll die, pass on, and they'll try to convert her again in heaven.
True. I think there is some of that going on. I mean, some a fear on the part of people who have left that their family members will do proxy work for them after they've died, or somehow it's one way Latter-day Saints cope, which is, well, we couldn't get them back in the fold in this life, but they'll for sure come back in the hereafter. Again, that's hurtful and condescending.
Earlier we talked about Scott Howell. A little bit later in your story, you talk about the fact that, I guess, devout Latter-day Saints who maybe want to be Democrats, some of them find it hard because there's a fair number of people, former Latter-day Saints, right, who are using the party, I guess, believe in its precepts, but kind of congregate in the Democratic Party as kind of a marker. I'm a former Latter-day Saint.
Right. Yeah, right.
Makes it hard, I guess, for some of these devout Latter-day Saints who want to be in the party as well. They feel it makes it hard.
Yeah, Scott did talk about the fact that there's unfortunately some former members bring their hostility to the church into the party and spend a lot of time talking about how bad the church is and associating that with Republicans. And so they're in the Democratic Party and they bring that hostility. And Scott would like to see more members of Utah's Democratic Party not bring their hostility to the church into their discussions, but focus on what they have in common, the values of the party, quite apart from it. And Scott, personally, Scott, an active Latter-day Saint, believes that many of the goals and ideals of the Democratic Party actually line up with the church. And so he feels that it shouldn't be a place where people dump on the church.
It's interesting.
He understands it, but it didn't happen.
For sure. Oh, before I even started reading your story, I wondered, well, what about a married couple? That's because you do have that. One stays in the church, one leaves. You talk to it. Is it Katie or Caddy? Katie and Alan Mount. I guess I think he has left. She has stayed. So they have a podcast. So how do they make it work?
It's tricky. They told us it's tricky. There has to be a lot of respect. There can't be proselytizing on either side. A lot of open communication and finding the things that drew them to one another in the first place. You know, their mutual attractions, their commonalities, their apparent. You know, they just have to focus on their shared values and not on their no longer shared associations, like with the church or not with the church. And they admit that it's not easy and not everyone can do it, but boy, the more we talk to people in that group of 1,400, it's there are lots of married couples who do stay together and try to navigate this. And at the same time, there's lots of married couples who can't make it work and end up splitting up because of it.
Heidi Mason was interesting. She's a technical writer. And she said there, if you focus on, we'd share other interests, right, beyond religion, or maybe the religion's the divide, but you have many other interests, then you can make it work with friends.
Yeah, she still Heidi is in a group of friends that she's known forever since elementary school, and they're like still know one another. Um, and when she said she was leaving and becoming atheist, she said none of those friends, I mean, it really broke her up from her friends, or she felt a lot of judgment from them, except one person. And that is the person who said, you know, we have other things in common. We have other things we both like. Let's just focus on that. And that was very reassuring and comforting to her, she said.
You talked to a Mosiah Gonzalez. His first name would indicate maybe he would at least grew up in the church. um, he said he supported when his mother, he wasn't alive, I guess, then when his mother joined the church. But he supported that. I guess was his grandfather an alcoholic?
Yes.
There's alcoholism in the family. He said the church really helped the family. So
Right.
he respects that, even though he has left the church.
Yeah, he was good because he talked about, I mean, he has left, but his family, particularly his mom, but mom and dad both uh, treated him very lovingly and and were accepting of him, and at the same time he understood what the church had meant to them, and so he didn't spend any time really. He made his choice, but he didn't spend a lot of time dissing their choice. You know what I mean? In other words, there was mutual respect on both sides, and that is the way he has been able to maintain warm relations with his parents and family.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned this. Often there is this distrust, right, or suspicion, either from believing members or former members to the other side. What are you trying to do with me, right? Does anybody offer solutions? How do you lessen that distrust?
Again, the same kind of advice, which is keep talking, ask people, what do you mean? Call them out if they're, and just say, that is hurtful to me on whatever side. But probably the worst thing you can do is just go your separate ways or hurl insults to one another, accuse the people who are staying in of being, quote, toxic, and the people who have left of being, oh, you just wanted to sin. Try to withhold those kinds of judgments and really show love, basically. I mean, it sounds really trite, but that's pretty much the only thing that works is if you continue to care about your loved one on either side of this.
Now you do have a story where you have some quotes of the some 1,400 people who responded.
Yes.
Anything especially stand out to you?
Oh gosh. There were so many quotes that were really heartbreaking. Um, and I can't my immediately bring it up. I chose quotes that exemplified both the pain of splitting and the sort of spectrum. You know, some people said, I gave my life to the church and and I left, and it was like nobody talked to me after that, or no one said thank you for all those years of service. On the other hand, I talked to people who have stayed, or I mean, we got quotes from people who have stayed who said, you know, we're not all the same in the church, and give us a chance to show love. And um yeah, so I tried to choose sort of quotes that showed the spectrum, like the worst
Hmm.
people that didn't ever talk to their loved ones again, and then the best people who didn't see any rupture in the relationship. And then everybody sort of, one guy said he actually lost his job in a company that was run by members, and he was judged. And you know that there's pain in this
Hmm.
community from this split.
You have one under the heading of 1 foot in, 1 foot out, right? Kind of
Yeah,
not
yeah,
quite left yet. This was interesting. It's kind of melancholy. This person from American Fork says, I'm still in this phase. At the beginning, I experienced love bombing and a great deal of attention and then silence. I think that's kind of, there's
yeah,
a spectrum there, right?
kind of in the middle.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Uh,
yeah.
let's just mention briefly here one other story related, and that is Latter-day Saint leaders. What are they saying these days? Obviously, they're preaching to the believers. What are they telling the
Yes.
believers how to treat or reach out to the folks who have left the church?
Um, I think a lot of people might be pleasantly surprised to read their instructions to members. Again, their audience is members, and just say all the things I've just said, which is be kind, do more listening than talking, don't preach to them, don't constantly, you know, say, well, you'll be back. Don't judge them, don't make assumptions. They left because they want to quote sin, drink a cup of coffee or something, or worse. Uh, just and it also suggests things like, you know, what we're saying about finding things in common. It says, you know, do service together, or find projects that you both can do together. And a lot of patience, understanding, communication, kinds of things that are just sort of generally good advice.
Hmm.
One of the things we heard repeatedly among formers is that the current members didn't express much curiosity about why they left. And the advice from the church leaders is, yeah, don't be afraid of what they're going to say. If your faith is solid, just listen to what their experience has been and why they've chosen to step away. It's not going to hurt you, and it could help them. And so that was one of the pieces of advice. Uh, Again, I think people would be surprised. It it's it's a change, I think, in the last decade or decade and a half of in the past, church leaders might have been pretty harsh on people who have left, but it's definitely advising members to be their best selves and in sort of live out their beliefs.
Well, we urge you to read all of these stories in this latest iteration of the divide. Exploring the nastiest divide of all in Utah, Latter-day Saints versus former members is the headline. Important, and Tribune went out and got about 1,400 responses here. Peggy Fletcher Stack, senior religion reporter, has been with us to tell us about this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I always enjoy a chance to talk about this very important story.
Yes, I think everybody's touched by this. You've been listening to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. I'm Tom Williams. Hope you'll join me again next time.